What's up YouTube? My name is Label, and today I am honored to be joined by one of the most brilliant and talented people I have ever met. And today the two of us are going to show you how I created a 3D model of myself using nothing but a camera, a tripod, and a chair that spins. But before that, let's go talk about why I needed to make a 3D model of myself in the first place. Okay, so I've been working on planning out a self-portrait that I want to paint, and in doing this, I've been using a technique that I do often where I will plan out ideas in 3D software like Blender, because you can throw in all the objects you want in your scene as just basic shapes and then quickly prototype the composition, the perspective, and even the lighting and the shadow like 100 times faster than if you were just trying to imagine it or draw it out of your head. Now, the idea of this self-portrait is that it will be a profile view of me painting a front view of me, almost like the painting is a reflection in a mirror, so you end up with a front view and a profile view in the same image. And if that sounds confusing, it's because it is, and it's really hard to visualize. But that's where Blender comes in, because it makes it so easy to kind of lay out those angles and see how the perspective will work when it would be practically impossible to just visualize it. But in order to do that, I need to have a 3D model of myself to put into the scene. Okay, so that sounds good, but this simple idea sent me on a wildly impractical month-long descent into the dark underworld of LIDAR and photogrammetry, and almost falling to my death as I was spinning myself dizzy on top of this desk chair. And I do tend to have a fairly obsessive personality, but I'm sure you too have tried something where it really wasn't that important, but you just failed so hard that it made you that much more determined. But the harder you tried, the more it beat you down, until you just became so motivated that you're spending every waking minute of your life trying to find that last mushroom in the Mario level or whatever it is. And making this 3D model was kind of like that for me. But the thing is, I've actually made a lot of 3D models in the past, so I thought this would take like 30 minutes tops, but in reality, it was 30 days later and I was still getting models that looked like this over and over again. I even looked online for support, and there were basically no tutorials on making proper 3D models of humans at home. Everything I found looked terrible, and I realized this may actually be a much harder problem to solve than I first thought. But in the end, I had tried every app, every piece of software, every photogrammetry algorithm until I finally cracked it. And while this definitely looks a bit wonky, I actually think it's one of the cleanest and most detailed, like homemade 3D models of a human that anyone, with layperson skill like me can make. So if you watch through this video, I'll explain how I did everything wrong and how I eventually got it almost right, in case you'd like to try it out for yourself. The final technique is actually something you can do with just an iPhone, a tripod, and a chair like this that spins. Alright, so let's first really quickly talk about the technology involved here, because if you look into making 3D models of real-world objects, there's really two modern approaches. One is photogrammetry and the other one is LIDAR. And LIDAR is a technology that uses a grid of laser beams to determine the distance of various objects, as far as they are from the camera. So if you move all the way around an object with a LIDAR scanner, there's special software that can construct like a 3D mesh of the object. And if you combine that with the visual images taken that can create high-res textures, you end up with a really realistic looking model. And this may seem like an obscure technology, but actually all modern iPhones and iPads have two LIDAR scanners, one on the front for the Face ID and the other one on the back, which is a proper LIDAR scanner. And there's actually some really cool 3D apps out there that I've used to make models of my living room, my cactus, and a bunch of stuff that is really kind of fun, and I don't think it gets nearly enough attention for how cool it is. The other technology is called photogrammetry, and this doesn't require laser beams. It actually just takes a bunch of standard photos of an object from every angle, and you feed them into the photogrammetry algorithms, which do some magic to find the borders and stitch them together in 3D. And I like to think of this like a 3D panorama in a way, which kind of stitches a bunch of images together, but instead of as a scene, it's a 3D object. And if you wonder how Google Maps has those incredible 3D models of your house, this is it. In fact, there's an awesome YouTube video I found while doing research on this video that shows how Google does this with airplanes, which is really cool. So check that out in the comments if you're interested in more. But okay, now that we understand the technology that we're dealing with, the first thing I did was to pull out one of my favorite apps called Scaniverse, which is actually completely free on the iPhone. And what's really cool is that this one lets you take one scan with a really nice UI that guides you through the process. And after you finish, it's able to either process it as LIDAR or photogrammetry. And it'll recommend one or the other based on what it thinks your subject is. But then you can even save the raw data and go back later to try the other one to see which one works better. So as I was experimenting for my own model, I used this to make a 3D model of a cookie monster in terrible lighting. And it turned out amazing. And in general, I would highly recommend playing around with an app like this. Scaniverse is one of my top 5 favorite apps. It produces really good quality scans. It has a lot of options for capturing and even editing the scans. And the interface is really nice and intuitive to use. But anyways, once I saw Cookie Monster, I realized, okay, cool, we're basically done with this project. Let's get the scan of me and move on. So as a first test, I sat still and had a family member kind of attempt to take one of those scans of my upper body, kind of like the Cookie Monster, and I'm going to show you the results. So prepare yourself to be stunned by the detail and the clarity of this beautiful... Okay, I mean, the likeness is just uncanny, isn't it? Now, we tried a few more times in different lighting and environments and conditions, and it was just more of the same. So as much as I love Scaniverse for everything else, I just could not get it to work on me no matter what I tried. But the good news is this is not the only app out there. So I did some digging and I found out that Polycam supposedly does a really good job. It also has both LIDAR and photogrammetry capabilities, and the freemium model does make it like $60 versus free for Scaniverse, but I thought I would give it a shot. They have a free trial, so I wanted to see how well it would do. And I went outside in really neutral lighting, and I ended up with this. Yeah. It's not exactly perfect. So I realized there was actually a lot of promise in Polycam though. Despite those early efforts, I actually spent the next few weeks trying to get Polycam to work. I set up elaborate lighting systems in my garage with plenty of space for the person to move around me to take the scan, and I gave it every chance of success, and I could not get anything to work. But what I did learn at this point is that the scans using photogrammetry were doing a far better job than the ones using LIDAR, and I discovered that there was a reason for this. The LIDAR on the iPhone is extremely low resolution. You can see in this screenshot from iFixit's test that each of those dots is one laser beam, which kind of means it's like having a camera that's like 50 by 50 pixels, or like 1/20th of 1 megapixel. So the photo you end up with is something really pixelated. And that's kind of what happens here. It's like the 3D equivalent of pixelation, which just doesn't work if you're trying to take a scan of something like a face. So I did some more digging, and I discovered that Apple made their own photogrammetry software, probably because they realized how limited LiDAR scanning is for objects, and it's called
Object Capture.
And I ran the weird command line tool that they built. I brought back our old Cookie Monster buddy, and like, wow, it actually looks just as good as the ones in Scaniverse and the other apps. Around this time, I also discovered that there's an app someone made, which is basically just a user-friendly interface around this Apple codebase of reality capture. And this app is called PhotoCatch, which will be important soon. Okay, so I was really buoyed by my new photogrammetry discovery, and at this point I figured that it was just a matter of getting a combination of the right software with the right set of photos and the right lighting conditions. So I dragged my family member back into the 110-degree garage and had them use a real camera to actually take photos of me, not with the app, but with just a regular camera. And finally, after all this work, we had the final solution. Wait, what is this? How can it still be so bad when I've given it every chance of success? So we tried again and again, and at this point I was so frustrated because each one had some different piece that was just tantalizingly close to being perfect. Maybe my arms or my shoes or the top of my head, but the rest of it would fail completely, and I would just keep running the photos through different algorithms like Polycam and this Apple one, and I would wait 5 or 10 minutes for it to finish and then fail and then try again, but each set would have completely different results with no real patterns or any type of feedback to help me understand what was going wrong. So I realized at this point that it was totally impossible, and in a fit of rage, I just quit the project forever. But the next day, while doing more research, I noticed that the Apple video had an object on a spinning surface in some of the footage, where the camera was still on a tripod, but the object was spinning. So I noticed that the PhotoCatch app also had a video option, where it would basically just take the still frames from a video. So as a last-ditch effort, I made sure no one was watching, and I stood on top of this chair, and I just spun around in a circle while recording it with my iPhone on a tripod. And it worked. Like, this was actually the first scan that came out well from head to toe, and it definitely has some problems. As you can see, like, it wasn't able to get the top of my head because the angle was too low. But once again, the photogrammetry gods were just teasing me and pulling me back in. So I spent the next week experimenting with the spinning chair, and at one point I was in my garage with the lighting on top of this chair, and I got dizzy from spinning and almost tripped over the armrest and fell to my death. So at that point I realized that it was a wake-up call, and my life as a failed photogrammetry artist had gone too far, so I surrendered defeat and gave up my dreams once and for all. So the next day I got out some screwdrivers and I started disassembling my chair so that it would have no back to interfere with the images, because I thought that was causing problems. I also realized that the fast spinning was way too unreliable and too hard to stand still, which was introducing too much movement that kind of ruined the scans because it couldn't get an accurate read on my position. So I decided to do it sitting so I could control the movement and move more slowly. I also got out my real camera, though a smartphone would probably work. A real camera will get a little bit more detail. And I put it on a tripod and I positioned it at an angle that was a little bit higher than me, so it was able to look down and get both the top of my head and the rest of my torso. So then I set my camera up to do interval shooting of 1 photo per second. I also didn't use any lighting. I did it in this room, and it had really natural, soft lighting through the windows, which was good enough. But if your room is dark or has harsh shadows, you may need to adjust the lighting. So then I just sat still with my arms out and rotated slowly around and took 1 photo every second for about a minute. So I had 60 photos all the way around. And then finally I imported those photos into PhotoCatch, which is the software that uses the reality capture API on my Mac. And we did it. We finally had a clean scan. And obviously this technique will only give you an upper body scan, but I actually had quite a few good scans of my lower body left over from all the previous attempts. So I just combined the two in Blender and did some work to clean up the mesh and make it a little more polished. This is obviously optional, but if you know how to use it, it's a great tool. But in this one, you'll notice that my upper bodies and lower bodies are slightly disjointed. There was a little bit of difference in the lighting and the texturing, but for my purposes, it was more than enough. So to recap, if you want to try this, here is my advice. First, build one of these. If you add up the studio space costs, the 120 or so DSLR cameras, the rigs to put them on, the lighting, the shutter triggers, and the software, you can probably do it for under $250,000, which is really worth it in my opinion, so that you have a good scan to show your friends. But if for some reason that doesn't work for you, here is how you can get a clean scan of your entire upper body. First, start with a stool or a chair that spins and is fairly low to the ground. Again, ideally something without a back on it so that you can get all the way around. Second, set up this chair in an environment with kind of soft, neutral lighting. Outdoors in the shaded evening is ideal as long as your neighbors can't see you spinning around a chair by yourself. That would not be good. Number 3, make sure your clothes and skin contrast with the background. So for me, wearing light clothes, since I have fair skin, and then having a dark background was kind of helpful. It's not super important to have a really clean background, but it doesn't hurt. Number 4, get a camera on a tripod and position it about a foot or so above your head and several feet away, so it's looking down on you from this angle. And number 5, figure out, whether it's an app or a setting in your camera, how to take one photo a second, or just have a friend push the shutter button a whole bunch of times as you're spinning around. Definitely nobody will laugh at you. Number 6, if you have a newer Mac with an M1 or an M2 chip, which I realize is a minority of people, but still, that's the ideal way. You can download PhotoCatch for free from their website and use it to take all these photos and import them into PhotoCatch, usually on the medium or high settings for best results. But if you don't have a Mac, an iPhone with PhotoCatch, they do have a mobile app, that will work as well. And they'll give you like a few free scans on the mobile app. If you have Windows, you can use something called Mushroom, which is supposedly like the industry standard, but I don't have Windows, so I wasn't able to test it. If you have Android, I'm sure there's photogrammetry apps out there that you can import your photos into. So you have a lot of options, and I'd try them all and just see what works best for you. And finally, if you're really like serious about this and you're a proper 3D artist, the last step would be to import it into something like Blender or 3D Studio Max and clean up any inconsistencies or stray vectors that may have shown up in your model, and you'll be good to go. Okay, so we have our model, and if you remember like 4 hours ago when this terrible story started, the reason I needed this model was so that I could put it into Blender and figure out some crazy angle of reflection where I can have both a profile view and a front view of myself within the same painting composition. So let's see if it actually works. We can mock up a wall, we can add a floor and some rectangles to kind of represent a picture frame, and then maybe a mirror, which I'll ultimately make into a painting where I'm essentially painting myself in the painting. But for now, the mirror will work. And then boom, we just add myself into the scene and scale it to the right size. And this is so cool. The model looks absolutely hilarious here, but it totally works for what I needed to kind of visualize this scene. Now, in the end, I'll take high-res photos of the right poses for the final reference images to paint, but I can't do that without first knowing how to compose it here or how to pose for those photos. So being able to see this in 3D is actually kind of surreal. It's so much cooler than I could have imagined, and honestly, it was worth every minute. It's so satisfying to finally get this right. So yeah, as silly as this guy looks, I'm actually really happy with how he turned out in the end, and it's perfect for what I needed. If you have a chance to give this a shot, let me know how it goes in the comments, or send me your 3D selfie creations on Twitter @DrewLabel. I would love to see what you come up with. Otherwise, that's all for this one. If you found it interesting, please give it a thumbs up or subscribe. This is obviously a really new channel, and I'm working really hard on a lot of great content in the future. So if you want to see more stuff like this, it would really help out the channel if you could subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next one.